Thank you for tuning in to our annual video series from the International Symposium on Human Identification. We are very lucky to be here with Dr. Phoebe Stubblefield today. Phoebe, why don't you tell us about yourself and a little bit about your background?
Oh, certainly. So I'm the Interim Director of the CA Pound Human Identification Lab at the University of Florida. I've held that role for about a little over 2 years now. And the lab was founded by William R. Maples to provide skeletal analysis service for mostly medical examiners in Florida and at that time New York. And so we were one of the earliest, sometimes I want to say the earliest lab, a formal lab to provide uh, both recovery and analysis of skeletal remains when they're not actually skeletonized, but they're advanced decomposition. And when Dr. Maples passed away in '97, I was his last doctoral student. And then I left after I got my PhD in the normal course of things and worked at the University of North Dakota for 15 years running the forensic science program there. And after getting that program into a reasonable shape, UF had the position for uh, two different positions. It changed over time, but eventually the interim directorship became available to me, and I had come back to Florida to help out with casework, and then I stepped into that role. And so that was at about the same time as the Tulsa Race Massacre investigation started to come back, because I was involved in it 20 years ago as a consultant to the Tulsa Race Riot Commission. So there are only a few of us left after 20 years, but 20 years ago we produced a report, and my chapter in it was co-written with Leslie Rankin-Hill, my colleague, and I wrote what we would do if we get to the forensic component, and then the commission at that time didn't go forward, and then 20 years later, Mayor GT Bynum, mayor of the city of Tulsa, asked Scott Ellsworth, who was the lead historian on the Race Riot Commission report, if we would come back, if he could get the team together again, as it were. And so out of that original team, Clyde Snow was a senior forensic anthropologist, but he had passed. So I became that person. And the historian, one of the historians had passed. I get his name wrong. Richard Warner. And he had passed, but his daughter had a lot of his papers. And so we worked with her on some of that. And the state archaeologist of Oklahoma, Carrie Steckelbeck, came in because Bob Brooks I'm retired. And Leslie Rankin-Hill retired. And so she keeps in touch, but I can't quite get her to come into the field, but one day I hope so. And the rest of us, yeah, there's just really Scott and I on deck out of the first group.
That is a remarkable history. We are very lucky to have you talking to us today. I mean, there are quite a few talks about the Tulsa Race Massacre, and you really reading what you have shared already about some of the bodies exhumed at Oaklawn and the work you're doing. We'd love to hear about that. Can you tell us where you're at right now?
Well, even now, as I sit here, we're in the field working on the original 18 is what we call the area. So last summer, or the summer of 2021, we had opened up, really it's more like this L-shaped this blob with legs coming off of it, representing so the cemetery is shaped in rows, and we opened up about 5 rows and crossed several rows, just sampling for, is there anyone there? So we had done geophysical survey originally, but the soil there is very clay rich and it doesn't respond well to ground penetrating radar. So we knew there was something under there, but we were getting our data from, I think it was the magnetometer data that was showing us that there were signals, but they weren't organized. And when we finally excavated, this is still 2021, we found that these were unmarked burials. And so they're formal burials, they're spaced as burials, but is there a marker? Once there was a marker, our first burial, burial 1, She had a marker. It was buried. She had a temporary grave marker that had been buried in its upright position. At some point, someone had brought in a lot of fill and covered up the existing grave marker in its position. And so a lot of the burials there show that sign of everything is covered with another 3 feet of soil, and then you get to the natural soil. So part of that has to do with the landscape because they filled in a stream to acquire land to extend the cemetery, and so at any rate, we exposed about 30. There was a little over 30 burials. We did not exhume all of them because some of them were children. The cemetery has a lot of children, and it's an organized cemetery, so they were buried in a row. And in that row, we found our first individual that has gunshot wounds. So he was burial 27, male, mostly black. I had to say mostly because of the preservation allowing me to estimate his ancestry. Is he has signs of being of African descent, but not the best preservation for, say, a forensic case. And he had multiple gunshot wounds, and he was buried in the infant row, but at a depth different from the infants. And next to him was another infant, also buried at the same deeper depth. And so that was a kind of anomaly. We didn't expect an adult in a child row, but to see two buried at an atypical depth when we do know from our records that an infant was found dead at the same time period, May 31st to June 1st, and they had buried 21 males, or 20 individuals, 20 adults, one infant, so 21 individuals in that, somewhere in the colored potter's field of Oaklawn. So we've gotten one, and based on death certificate data, we should have about 14 or 15 gunshot wound victims. The number I varied a little bit because we have about 4 that were burned, and there were no autopsies. So if they were shot and burned, we won't know. And so how many individuals we'll find, we don't know. But we know we haven't looked sufficiently because we only have one that fits our criteria of being a male in a plain casket and having some sign of gunshot trauma. And with the preservation we see, will we be able to tell if they have gunshot trauma? I'm thinking it will vary because there's always the wound that only hits tissue. And in that case, unless these are softer lead bullets, at least the one we found with the gentleman so far. So if it hits bone, it's going to leave scatter, and we could detect the difference between lead scatter and the soil, the rocks in the soil. So I do have hope, but there's just no identifying someone who's gut shot and then the bullet's not there, you know. So I'm hoping everyone will have adequate signs of trauma. But first we got to find them. So even now we're examining new area. We've exposed new area south and east of the infant row. We're saving that for later because if it stays being infants, we're just going to look, and we can see in the soil a stain in the soil that's shaped by digging and putting in a container. And if it's a small square, then we won't excavate further.
What a remarkable mix of the stories that have been told in the history of the area, and then using that to excavate and then examine and try to identify, very
We are
specifically.
combining a lot of data. I've looked somewhat into how the cemetery was used because the time period from its origin until about 1929, there was one sexton, and the end date is set by when he disappears from the city directory. So it could have been in 28, but that was one individual. And what we are encountering in the cemetery, you say mass grave or you say potter's field, both of those terms are charged with imagery. And whatever your favorite style of mass grave is, that's what you think of when you say mass grave. You think potter's field, I say potter's field and I think just chaos, and that the whole place is just skeletons sticking out half out of the earth. I'm really envisioning this picture from Mexico of a church cemetery, potter's field, that was just people borrowing skeletal materials for artwork, and that is the kind of landscape we were thinking we'd encounter. And in reality, is that organized cemetery, even in the potter's field. And I go, we're looking at the mental landscape of that one sexton operating until 1928, 29. After that, who knows? And I don't know if I'll be able to test it, but I like to think that what we can see is that that man said he had records, Sexton Feely. He said he kept records, but he had a great spatial memory, and his grave digger said, "Yep." He says, "Dig here. We've never hit another grave," and yet the records the city has for the cemetery, the pages for that part of the cemetery, those pages were removed from the cemetery records. So I think it's probably fairly obvious where they're buried, but we don't have the records, so we have to do the hard search. And it's probably obvious in part because it's an organized cemetery, not a chaos cemetery. And so they had to get rid of those records at some point. I'm thinking it might have even been as early as when he died. Someone may have pulled them, but we'll never know when it occurred. We just know it was prior to when the prior to when. I think what was the earliest that Scott said he looked into it? Might have been certainly prior to the 70s, but yeah, those records are lost. So we combine what records we can find with this ground search that makes me go, if we're in an area that has no headstones, is it empty? I mean, no headstones anywhere. So our excavation in 2020, we excavated the part on the map that's called the Sexton's area, and it is blank. And so there were some crepe myrtle trees buried along the fence, and we excavated ahead of them and to the north of them. Didn't encounter a single burial. So it is as blank as it looks like on the map. And I assume that it was dedicated to the sexton, as if he would have had children and buried his family there and stayed on. But because near the edge of it, the sexton that worked afterwards, Willie Cravens, I think his name was, he's buried there. But he's on the very edge near the black part of the, so sections 13 and 14 and part of section 12 were dedicated to black burials, paid burials. And section 15 was, I'm pretty sure, the ambiguous burials, just because of some of the data I've come across. And everyone else was mostly white, sort of. Or not black, might be better, maybe. And but I think there was a time where if you just got in early with your money, you could get a space no matter what color you were. But I'm still testing that. There's this one area in section either 1 or 4 where the person owns a block and it says they're colored in the cemetery records that we do have. So I'm like, they got in there early. And there was a time you could be buried there no matter who you were. Actually, for most of the cemetery's history, I think. But I think sometime in the early 30s, they just stopped burying people because they couldn't tell who was buried in section 20 because the records were thrown out and it was too risky. So, but we are still encountering empty spots. So some of that map, that data is actually correct. So, how conservative is this location? But we'll only know once we keep digging. So it's because I doubt those records exist somewhere else, the pages out of the cemetery. But so it will just keep excavating.
Wow, so you really are in the heart of it again. I mean,
Yeah. So we clear the soil off till we can see the outlines of the burial. Sometimes, because a lot of soil was brought in to raise the ground level and then cover up the existing burials, which I still find just painful. It's like, can you try a little harder? A monument that it takes 2 people to move, they just bury it. Whenever they were. Of course, now we don't know who did that, but still, it's like, really? But once in the soil that was brought in, sometimes it's just very hard to see the outline of the casket. And but we've gotten pretty good at reading this landscape the archaeologists and all of us will stand there and go, yeah, the archaeologists are very skilled. My archaeology colleagues, they know what they're doing. So today they're hand digging those burials, and by the time I get back, I may have the first arrivals at the lab. But maybe they'll text me and let me know. We'll see.
Wow, that could change your talk dramatically or add to it. Absolutely.
Well, yeah, no, not that dramatically.
Well,
Yeah.
I don't think a lot of people realize how much goes into this. Historians, archaeologists, your specialty with skeletal remains, the fact that you worked on this 20 years ago and you're back again. I want to get into more of the science of what you do, but before we do, you have roots in Tulsa. So, how does this feel to you?
It really feels like a blessing. I didn't go into forensic anthropology because I knew there was a race massacre or a riot or a disaster, any of the labels it's had. I didn't know about it because my parents didn't talk about it. They didn't live in Tulsa until after they were born afterwards, but their parents weren't there. They were in Clearview and Texas. Well, no, they were all in Oklahoma by then. But at any rate, only my aunt was living in Tulsa. And so she lost her home to the riot, but they were relatively well off. Ellis Walker Woods was my uncle, and Anna Woods is I'm actually related to her because her sister married my grandfather. And so the Woods recovered readily and led part of the recovery. He was principal of Booker T. Washington High School, and so that was one of the backup hospital until they built another hospital, the one that became the Morris Willows Hospital. And so despite all that activity, I hadn't heard about it. And when Scott Ellsworth invited me to participate in the Race Riot Commission report, I said, hey, there's this report we're putting together because there was a race riot in Tulsa. And my mother said, yeah, your Aunt Anna lost her house. And so she knew the whole time, but it wasn't something that was on their radar. So yeah, so coming back to Tulsa now, it's interesting to me. Because I see all these forces acting and or the outcomes of just history and race relations, and some part of me is I see that you have a Tulsa for a while was the same setting as many black people encountered in the South. So, and I grew up in Los Angeles, and I had a different experience. So, that book, The Warmth of Other Suns?
Yes, yeah.
So I hadn't read that book until this investigation started. And I see little echoes because I go, oh, my parents did that. Only they did that from Tulsa. My dad went to college. He was one of the first black college students at the University of Michigan. And I found this little snippet he had in the pile of papers you go through when your parents have passed and you find all their stuff. And he had gotten a scholarship to the University of Michigan, he and the three of his classmates. And I was like, oh, I had no idea. That's how they were connected, all this history. And once he got his degree, he packed his family up and they moved to California. And that actual practice that outcome happened to a lot of the survivors, a few that I've traced, survivors of the race massacre. So like the Gurley, O.W. Gurley, he and his wife, they tried to recover, and you see them borrowing money for furniture and things in 22 and 23, but by 24 they're in LA, and that's where they live until they die. And one of the families, this is probably an Allison story, so I'm not going to tell it because I think Allison Wilde will tell all of it. But we traced this woman that we were looking for, and her sons moved to California. And everybody moves to California. So you have actions where you oppress people or harass them or whatever, whatever you're doing to try and have a similar economy using black people that existed prior, with slavery. So whatever the echo of the economy is, and the black people get up and move. But I look at that and I see, we used to talk about white flight in LA, but here I see with this southern migration, you take the people who are able to migrate, and they're going to be your most alert or sharpest or motivated people, and they get up and leave. And who stays? Well, people who getting by or maybe aren't going to change the world. Or and what does that do to your whole your society to have this constant drain? We get ahead and those people leave, and you get ahead a little and they leave again. And yet that's a large history of African American interaction with the South and other places. So I have come to look at Oklahoma more like, oh, it was the South too. It wasn't quite as bad, actually, not at all as bad. But I see those same forces were in effect. So coming back to Tulsa, especially as an adult, where I see the echoes of, oh, here's where my aunt and uncle lived, and my grandfather's house was razed, so I can't even find the lot. But my aunt's house is still there, and my cousins live in it. And I look at that, and I go, that neighborhood has not changed at all. The house is the same house. If I knew better, I'd find my uncle's house. But I go over here, downtown. We never went downtown. Or I go to Utica Square. Actually, I had visited it once as a teenager, vacationing with my parents. So that kind of seeing Tulsa as the kind of city where your money is green, you can access it no matter what color you are. It has that aspect. I can do that. While my cousin, who grew up there and returned to Tulsa to take care of his parents, he still has that hesitation of, can black people go there? Not as bad as his mother did, though, because I would visit as an adult, and I said to my aunt, two of my aunts, they were still living, and I said, hey, let's go to this diner over here on Route 66. It's Art Deco in style. Let's go eat there. And my senior aunt turns to her sister and says, do black people eat there? And they sit there and think for a second. They go, yeah, I think it's probably safe. And so that was their world. And I get it. Who wants their food sneezed on or spat in? And I mean, it's not like that doesn't happen no matter what color you are. So I get it. But that was their world. Their son has shades of it. He can't wait to, he can't wait, but he expects to move back to Seattle because he doesn't want to live in racist Tulsa. That's his expression, not mine. And then when I come into town, I say, hey, let's go over to the gathering place. And he's like, I never knew this was over here. And I'm like, yeah, because we're talking socioeconomics here, this isn't just about race. This is where your money will take you. I'm not saying you won't run into walls, but your money's green. And seeing that development is really all this twisted together conglomerate of both visions and blessings, because my experiences in Tulsa work for me. I have a harder time in Florida than I do in Tulsa as a black person. And so I find that a little ironic considering the nature of this research, but also appropriate because Tulsa has moved on, faster than other places. And I liked seeing that because this city of Tulsa is not the same city of Tulsa as in 1921. And reading the history of that time, I can tell I've only scratched the surface on what was going on in the Reconstruction phase when the Greenwood residents were trying to rebuild, and having the city commissioners say, oh, no, you can't rebuild. And they put in police to stop rebuilding, and the police were thugs. And so the people, you hear the Greenwood residents writing, and they're thugs, and then they have the nerve to say, hey, you need to keep hiring us. Because the city said, we're done. We don't need, just go ahead and rebuild. We don't need those people. We're not going to pay the police to stop you from rebuilding because you can go ahead and rebuild. We lost that fight. And yet the thugs said, well, can't you pay us? Can't you Greenwood people pay us so we can keep working here as police? You need us. And they're like, no, you guys were the ones attacking us for rebuilding. That kind of, yeah, that is, there's a newspaper article. So because I've been looking for just side information about where are our decedents. And so even though I'm skeletal, uh, I sat down and I said, well, let's look at all the death certificates. Well, Clyde Snow got all the death certificates, but he passed away, and he was about as organized as I am. So we couldn't find them. And so I ordered all of the ones for June and July and August. And then I just kept going until I ran into December because we needed to pick up people who had died after the fact. And could we get any indication of did they have a riot death? Did they riot on the certificate? We haven't found any. Okay, that's not true. But that's not my story. So getting the death certificates has been helpful. We can't hardly read them. They're written in cursive. So it's a slow process. We're only through July. And then we have special cases that we're hitting here and there. But I'll leave that to one of my colleagues to talk about. But the other part of that, since it's taking a long time to read these things, and most of them are children. So it's just a lot of, we take for granted we take for granted the success at having children when they're literally probably half. It may only be a third. It may depend on the month, but it's stillborn, premature, fell in a fire, drank strychnine, stillborn, and for a third of the death certificates. And there were times in the newspaper where they said, "Oh, the stork beat the Grim Reaper." So that is the life in 1921, month to month. Actually, earlier too. A lot of the 1910, and I've looked at a lot of I looked at 1910 and earlier because the sexton would make a report of how many people he'd buried in a month, and some years he made the annual report, and the city didn't guess, or it may not know actually, but they don't find the reports, just the minutes from those meetings. But if I had the reports, then I could conceivably come up with an approximation of how many people should be buried in Oaklawn. But they didn't keep those. So I only have the newspaper versions, which are when they reported, when they didn't, but that's how I get all these accounts of how hard it was to get out of childhood back in from 1900s up through the 1920s. It was, and they were struggling with tuberculosis and typhoid, so they would vaccinate for typhoid, and that's one of the things they did to everybody in the concentration camps because they didn't want an outbreak. But the other, measles, we see signs of childhood high fevers in some of the decedents we excavated. They had a feature called enamel hypoplasia, where if it's really bad, if you have a really high fever as an infant, because it has to be when you just have the crowns of your teeth. You know how teeth form? And so when it's just the cusps forming, the high fever turns off the enamel production, but the tooth keeps growing. So the dentin's exposed, and sometimes it's just a wrinkle in an otherwise smooth face of enamel. And if it's really bad, it's strings of divots, like necklaces on the teeth, but going in rows. So a necklace here, then a good moment you're healthy, then another necklace, and you survived, another necklace. So repeated bouts and severe high fevers. It just has to be a high fever. So like measles or probably mumps too. Some of the individuals must have caught every single childhood disease they could catch because their teeth were just necklaces. I think that's why we saw so many gold teeth in there, because they don't look good, and they can be more fragile. So at any rate, disease. So sorry, I keep going on, but it's a record search. Plus, I look at the skeletal material because I can examine these remains, but we don't have, in a modern forensic case, I would compare a probable identity to the skeletal identity. How old is the person? How tall are they? But we don't have heights. I mean, granted, some of these individuals have World War I registration cards, so we have that height. But the age is a range, the height is a range, and but ancestry is pre-filtered because of where we're digging, and We now know we can pretty much get sex pretty well from this level of preservation. So that comparison, we get, oh, male, such and such height, such and such age. But the IDs on the death certificates for these individuals, sometimes they said, oh, about 30, about 35. They're all rounded up to 5 and 0, except for a few. Like I have one unknown where they put in 28. I'm like, and he's unknown? How do you know he's 28 years old? Yeah, I don't know what's going to happen with that. So hopefully, maybe the DNA will tell us who they actually are, who their identities are, because we can't do a normal process of elimination where we get down to, well, here are all my black males of a certain height and age. We can't do that in this case.
The complexity of everything you just shared it's enormous. I think it's hard for people to understand.
It's hard
You
for me
ha-
to keep track.
yeah.
Because one, sometimes I'm looking at reading death certificates and going, oh my goodness gracious. And then it's just the try to get old, just try to get old. And then other times I'm reading the newspaper, and one of the mysteries we did resolve that I can actually talk about is so we go, oh, we're looking for 21 minus the 2 that we know are there, and then minus the infant. Males buried in Oaklawn Cemetery. Everyone else that was killed, because there were 39 deaths, certificated deaths, they were transported. They were all males, white males and black males. All the white males were either transported or they were buried in Rose Hill. And that cemetery opened in 1916, Memorial Garden. And but if you look at the stats for 1921, they buried a lot of white people there, not anybody else. I think one Native American person got buried there in 1 month that I was looking at. But that is private. So there was a point about all that. I was stumbling through the newspapers and reading about the trial of who caused this, and I found an article from June 12th, about June 12th, 1921. So this is full on recovery. Everyone's still in concentration camps. It's that stage, and not the Red Cross, the YMCA, I think. A YMCA representative said, well, we have to ship some of the patients to other cities because we just can't cope with the load. And I'm like, oh, now you tell us. So people who died in other cities will be certificated in this other city, and with or without a riot death. So we won't get all of them. So that explains why we have no women, no children, and no old people.
Because they were likely transported.
Yeah, or they died, or they were recovered during the martial law period and are buried in a traditional hidden mass grave, which I think is both of those circumstances. So that because we found one woman died in another city, and but I bet a lot of the women, children, and old people were collected on those days of martial law.
This must be so much to take in. You started with some of the social dynamics and the flight, and unable to rebuild or not wanting to rebuild with the shadow of violence. There's so much to the story, and I feel like we're so fortunate to have so many people talking about different aspects of it.
We're
So
a great team.
it's
We really are.
remarkable to hear about it. For your part, the skeletal, let's talk about, you went into some things about teeth that I never heard that are very interesting. What are you looking at? What are some of the pieces that you've done so far, or that you expect to do as you go forward?
Well, in one sense, I think there will be less. This current round will actually be less interesting because we really are only going after people in plain caskets. Now I say people, but in this first round, only men were in plain caskets. All the women had nice caskets. So I don't think we'll get any women. And one of the preservation we see of these remains after 100-something years is we can often just barely get the part of the pelvic girdle that is a real strong indicator of sex. And so we're headed towards probably everyone will be male just because it's a plain casket. So that takes away some of the human variation that's interesting. I thought I would see more healed fractures because I figured, you go, well, they're black people. Um, don't they have hard lives? I mean, isn't aren't they working hard? And what we saw was not healed fractures, but women with arms like men, because they were washerwomen. So they had the deltoid attachment was just robust, and I was like, wow, these we're just phoning it in on this activity level, but these women had some robust arms, and so again, we'll be sorting them out because plain casketed. But those features, I was surprised about the lack of healed fractures. We had one gentleman that had a healed jaw fracture, so but that was from a previous gunshot wound, so he'd survived that. But he also had like one or two gold teeth, and I thought, oh, it's because probably that's holding together what few teeth he had left on the side where the bullet went through. So, dental care at that time was oddly common. We didn't expect that. Didn't. I did see another newspaper article where the writer was complaining about, we don't need to go to the Yukon. We're throwing all this gold teeth away in the cemetery. And that was before we'd opened. And I just clipped it and went on. And now I see, oh, yeah, see how many people did we see gold teeth on? 3? And so, yeah, it was a thing. And so after last season, I said, oh, I'm going to go get a gold tooth. And everyone's, no, you're not. No, you're not. But come on, this tooth. No. So it has clearly faded from style. So no gold teeth. But yeah. But as far as, because no women, we probably won't see any infants this time either. And because they would be women who died in childbirth or near childbirth buried with the infant. So we won't get that. We're not, this phase of the excavation is targeting plain casketed males because we know we're zeroing in on their location, but we have a lot of ground to cover because Section 20 is a large area of the cemetery, but we don't, we only have a few weeks here and then the next set a few weeks. So, and then we have to be safe because if you dig too large a hole into areas that we dug last year, the previous year's soil can be unstable, and so we have to make sure everyone's going to be safe hand digging in there. But they aren't buried very deeply, so we've been spared one risk. But
Okay.
some of the skeletal features I just thought we'd see. No, really, it was going to be healed fractures. I was ready to see some, like well, actually that kills you a lot, but healed femoral fractures, because that's a mighty bone. I thought surely we'll see that because this is the world of, yeah, you just have to get better and then go back to work. And so far, rib fractures are out because the preservation just isn't good enough. Um, but arms, legs, we get those whole shafts. They show up well. Yep, nothing.
Wow. Well, yeah, it must be surprising. Also amazing the things you can see, like, the level of work that was being done by the
Robust.
women.
Yeah.
That's, yeah, robust, exactly. I know you have so much work yet to do, but then how do you target the next excavation? Are there pieces you're taking, that you're learning about now that will help with that?
Skeletally, we are trying to preserve as much of either. So what happens is we expose the remains, but their preservation is like the clock starts ticking. So we're taking more images of the remains as they're exposed because this part of the skull we often can see it's there, but then by the time we lift the remains up, this part's intact and this part's intact, but nothing in between because it's very fragile. So this part of the maxilla, the upper jaw that touches the nasals, I'm sure it was there when we first started, and I had that experience working on Burial One, watching it collapse while we cleaned it up, and so in that context, we're going to try and capture images of parts that probably won't make it into lab, so that we might reconstruct more than just this durable outer wall. And so that's really our main difference this investigation prior than to our summer one is more images, because we did get enough data just from the skeleton to often go, yeah, it's a guy, or it's a woman. They're mostly black, or not, or we can't tell at all. And so preservation is in our favor, but we can use a little more technology.
Yeah, and really that was going to be my next question. What missing elements are making it challenging, and how do you work around that? And it sounds like, it takes a lot more work. I mean, you really need, the history, the death certificates, everything that surrounds it to fill
And
in
it
some of the
will be
pieces.
difficult to match these individuals to their death certificates,
Mhm.
because we're talking men in a class. So these are, because although there's no women, so they're all men, and they're around an age group, 30s, 40s, and that's still the same person again and again. So matching them to these generic ages in the death certificates, we really are relying on, ultimately, if we can get them above ground, and demonstrate that they had trauma, that they didn't just, like one of our gentlemen from last summer died of metastatic disease. So he lived and died. And uh, identifying that, we were able to identify that with his skeleton because the disease showed up on his x-rays, but we won't get him identified,
Right.
because there's no medical records, and he's a problematic DNA case too. So
Okay.
yeah.
It's amazing how the bodies tell so many stories in addition to the other side that you're getting. But certainly Tulsa isn't the only area where victims of racial violence may lie in mass graves, or how could these efforts, do you think, and this is more of an opinion question, how could they affect other places nationally?
I hope that other cities or towns will be inspired to try to find, because especially if they already have a narrative of buried here, the individuals are buried here. uh, I'm hoping they'll look at our process, the best parts of it, and say, okay, we need to, who are the local stakeholders? Who living here is related to these remains or these people we're looking for, and who are their friends, and do we have political help in our whatever the population is, to go, can we fund this search, and let's get a team together, because who's on the team? Because you're going to need archaeologists. You're going, depending on your time frame, you may need a anthropologist, a forensic anthropologist, or an osteologist. But I always say, get the forensic anthropologist and save some trouble, and for the trauma. And you may need an historian, depending on where you're getting your knowledge of where the burial is, or how the person became, ended up dead. Will there be features? Because when you hear about some of the lynchings and some of just the amount of damage done to the remains, you I get a picture of, oh, okay, so there may be signs of sharp force, but it'll be mostly blunt force, and um, gunshot wounds, but there won't be any hands or feet, because they'll probably have been souvenired off. And so if we find an individual like that, then we go, okay, that's most likely your person. So situations like that um, can be, as on a teamwork basis, researched, but there has to be someone willing to go, hey, my great great or uncle was killed in this way. We know he's buried in somewhere in there, and or maybe even knowing exactly where. But to pursue it, someone has to have the personal urge to pursue it. It's not the kind of this investigation isn't the kind of investigation you do externally. Um, it's too old, and too. I'm thinking, and I'm still working on this thought, but I'm thinking that for any moment like this, there really needs to be the people affected need to be able to say, fix it, do something, not have the state or an external agent say, do something. And that's how we've operated with the Race Massacre investigation. So this wasn't
Absolutely.
just Mayor Bynum going, let's fix this. This was Mayor Bynum going, oh, yeah, people are still asking about it. Let's fix it. So
Agreed. I mean, I do think you need that movement on the ground, and I hope that you can, in other areas, secure the national press to maybe put a little bit of pressure on the politicians involved
and
and
then
get
boom.
something moving.
And
Yeah.
well, I hear little things because think how, like the other day, NPR was saying how Spain is going to look up the people who were killed by Franco, and I'm like, really? I didn't think that would ever happen. And or the boarding schools, the Indian boarding schools. There's probably not a single one that doesn't have a cemetery, and probably other boarding schools too. But let's not think about that too closely right now. But state hospitals, boarding schools, hospitals for the insane. Just add labels. Did you read the Immortal Cells of Henrietta Lacks? Remember
Yes,
that?
one of my favorite books.
And how she
Yes.
found the pictures, the author found the pictures of the daughter that was died there. And
It's a
so,
powerful
yeah,
book. That is,
yes.
oh, God.
And that's part of its power is the timeliness of it. The record's still there, I wonder if those records still exist now after her book. That's just when I worked in North Dakota, uh, I started a body donation program there, and I was working with the anatomy department, and just for a point of history, they said, we've had a medical program of some kind since near the origins of the university in North Dakota, so the 1800s, and they would dissect people, men usually, but people who died anonymously who came in on the riverboat trade, because there was a riverboat trade on the Red River then. And so if no one claimed them right away, which of course no one's going to if you're a boat hand and you suddenly die, they would dissect them. But they would take pictures of them in case someone wanted to claim the body later. And in the modern era, like in the 90s, or when did I start working there? No, I guess it might have been the late 90s, might have been even in the 2000s. They found the collection of pictures and destroyed them. They said some of them were inappropriate, so they destroyed them. And I thought, well, there goes that hope of ever being ID'd then. Um, you couldn't just save this part. I don't know. But yeah, so that kind of practice, when you see that the information might get out somewhere and you do a preemptive destruction, other, you know, that can affect other searches. But I do like that one of our tools available at the end of the day is maybe DNA analysis, but that still gets us to are there family members that will have profiles that can be traced back to these people? Because we have one of the longer or larger family tree efforts for this kind of search compared to a forensic one, where you're only looking for their parents or sibling, you know. So sometimes just them if they have a profile stored somewhere. But with the Tulsa Race Massacre, we're looking at third and fourth cousins, and so getting the word out that hey, we're having successful. At least I hope to hear about that. Successful profiles and getting some family names. I think that will encourage other families to come forward eventually and say, this happened to us too. But we know where, or we think we know where our loved one was buried. Can we get justice, at least acknowledgement that get them back? And so, but it's going to be a multi-year process to get to that stage because there are no guarantees. We can get them identified. We can find out who the people are that we're exhuming. Their families don't have to be interested.
Well, I hope you do. I hope the attention that's being shined on it does bring people forward to help move the
And
effort
so
more
far, so good.
quickly. Yeah, it's very exciting to hear about that. Feels like some real change and movement after a very, very long time.
Well, and Tulsa has been doing very well. There are political issues and factions have risen, but we have been going forward. Nevertheless, the city backs it. The city commissioners supported funding the current excavation. They put $1 million aside for it, and that was more money than we had. That's a real line in the budget as opposed to the previous excavation, which was using leftover money. And so that's a serious commitment. So I just hope that when we get our individuals found, even the ones that are just contributing by having been exhumed at the same time, that the impact will affect people still local in Tulsa so that they can go, I got my family member back. Because
Yeah, that's a meaningful commitment, and then it educates the next generation and continues that forward. So feels like
and
it's
in one sense, we'll recover a little bit of that cemetery because it is so
absolutely.
unmarked in places.
Mm.
In
You,
places, I mean, some of that's just economic because you know how it is. If you can't afford a headstone, you just can't afford it. So, but man, the buried headstones make it interesting.
yes, sounds like a fascinating project, a complex, but with implications that are wide ranging for a lot of different people. Circling back a little, you mentioned body donation. So you're involved in a body donation program. Am I right about that?
Yes,
Is
yes.
that
So I started one for the Pound Lab. It had an informal one. Every now and then, a family would donate the remains of someone they'd lost in a forensic context, and but it wasn't formalized in the sense of, hey, I consent to how you use the remains, and I needed people to be able to consent to not just that we might have the skeleton, but we might destroy it in testing and research, or we might take pictures of it. Or, not the flesh remains, but the skeleton. And while you won't recognize them unless there's like, well, a gold tooth or something, something observable in life. But I want the families to consent or the donor to consent, not know upfront that yes, the remains could be used in imaging or destructive testing, or they could not consent. The only thing they have to consent to is donation, and if they say don't take images, we don't take images.
okay? And I assume that helps move the research forward. So
It does. Like some of our work with the Tulsa remains has to do with 3D modeling, trying because of this gap right here, and where can we go with reconstructing that gap virtually. And while we're still in the early days of just even figuring out, can we do that? The image, the static photos will help us figure that out. I hope one day it'll speak to memorialization if we get IDs. I hope, but working with the donors, we can perfect our skill. We've gotten very good at scanning non-humans, and so we're ramping up to eventually, because we have some donors now, and they've consented to being imaged or photographed or 3D modeled, or so. But we're also in effect shaping what does it mean to 3D model some person's skeleton, because you publish that model. Well, it's Halloween. Well, I go, oh, I recognize that skull. Because that's where when you disseminate 3D models, you lose control of it, and that's a big issue in anatomy. What does it mean to share any of the images? And I come from a long history of, oh, you go to the meetings and everybody's showing their favorite case, and it's anonymized, but you see or unless it's not, the historic murders, and um, you see the victim again and again, and it's in books. And is that appropriate? Well, sentiments change. It was appropriate then. Is it appropriate now? And will it be appropriate in 30 years when it's the printout of a scanned skull? Well, for most skulls, they're still anonymous. But if facial reconstruction somehow improves to the point where, to me, they look like the actual person, because I never can see the person in the reconstruction. I'm like, well, whatever they need to hit, they're not hitting it for me. But what if they do hit that, and so you reconstruct that, and somebody goes, oh, there's Uncle Fred, who's but it's supposed to be anonymous, or is it? He donated. So we have to get to that concept of privacy or
yeah,
not privacy.
yeah, ethical and privacy concerns are always part of the discussion. It feels like in the 12 years I've been talking to people in this field, and it does evolve over time, and standards do evolve over time as the technology changes. So
And it would be nice
yeah.
to just be able to give consent, uh,
Mm-hmm.
uh, or not. Yeah, and so even though these are decedents, and there is some discussion over you can't harm dead people, and I'm like, yeah, that's true, they're dead, but you might be able to harm their family through them, and that's the part I'm trying to avoid.
Yeah.
And we're not done. We as a discipline, how forensic anthropology contributes. I have the luxury of being in one of the few states that says you can't use these forensic cases for research. You can't conduct research on their parts while you have them, and you can't show their pictures because of the Dale Earnhardt law. And I'm like, oh, well, I can work with this, because it creates this concept of let a donor consent instead of being used, which is very handy. Even though I didn't know about the history of using black bodies in anatomy, I didn't know about that till much later. I didn't know that was a thing. But now we just use bodies, without preference. But maybe there's a little more. We're not grave robbing. We're not stealing them. We're not dissecting. Well, it depends on which state you're in. You can probably still get dissected if you're not claimed in time, but it's state by state. But generally, we may not be doing that nearly as much anymore. And so we have this idea, we can treat dead people a little better. So I look at my work at UF and how the race massacre is, the investigation is proceeding, how we're being careful to keep images of the remains out of because it's just rude, but to keep the images out of the media, and have the community members on site able to escort the remains to the lab. It's really important to me to let the community reconnect with these people that have been anonymized, that final identity stolen away even, and we're putting a little bit of it back, but with this idea of respect too for the dead in this way of preserving their identity. So that's just something that will continue to develop.
I think we're really lucky to have such a thoughtful discussion on that here. And I'm glad we got into that piece of it as well, in addition to so much of the work that you're doing. Is there anything we haven't touched on that you want to make sure we share?
So, at least for the race massacre investigation, so we're still in progress. And last summer's, or the summer 2021 excavation, we recovered 14 adults that we looked at, and 6 men, 8 women. And that process only yielded, I just emphasize this, we excavated multiple adults because we didn't know what we were going to find in there. And knowing what we know now about the preservation, that's orderly cemetery, all those things we learned last summer, that's shaped how we're pursuing this investigation. And we'll probably continue to shape unless we find a bunch of them. And I doubt that'll happen because the sexton couldn't seem to bury people who died in the same week next to each other. So, and at least in the other Potter's Field, I don't know what he would have said about the colored ones because the records are gone. So, but if we might find 3 together or 4 together. I just doubt we'll find 10. And in that context, I foresee more work. But at the end of the day, we have both preservation and persistence in our favor. So if we can just keep digging, we'll find them.
That is a beautiful way to put it, preservation and persistence.
Well, I was worried they were just going to be just pancakes because we did not know what we were going to find. And I've seen worse preservation because bones in Florida.
I can only
the sand is hungry.
imagine. Yeah,
So
depending on where. Yes. Oh.
Yeah.
Have you attended ISHI before?
No. Unfortunately,
Oh, it's your
this
first.
is my first visit, and because of the timing, I'm like, I'm here, so I'll speak, and then I'll leave tomorrow.
Oh, well, welcome. We are so lucky to have you. We so appreciate you sharing your work.
I appreciate your interest in our investigation.
Absolutely.
We are remaking history. Literally, anytime, any moment like this, interviews, however far they're dispersed, we get to undo that discard of the cemetery records or I'm not trying to change the history from then or the accumulated issues contributing to now, but hopefully there won't be any, clearly we just make anything up as we go nowadays, but I look at all of these moments as contributing to reestablishing that this event happened. It was bad, but we've taken responsibility for it in the way we can, today.
Yeah.
So.
Well, you're reaching a big audience who's very involved, very excited to hear about that.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to the presentations tomorrow because I want to hear about the DNA, and I'm really looking forward to Allison's presentation because, we talk a lot, and so I want to know what part will she say. I hope she'll tell the part that I keep going on. I'm not going to share that. I think it's her story. I hope she will, but the Danny's part, I'm hoping maybe we've got family names now. I'm thinking there'll be many based on my own genealogy. I sold my DNA to 23andMe, so.
Me too.
Didn't get anything for it. So it doesn't yield family hits for me. They're all third and fourth cousins.
Really?
Yeah. And as Allison has told me now, well, Ancestry is really better or you could try this other one. But, for African Americans looking for family hits, most go to Ancestry or this other one I can't remember the name of.
Okay.
And my twin sister, I have we're homozygotic twins, and she went with Ancestry. So yeah, there are cousins. There, the cousins that are related to Anna and Ellis Woods, those cousins. Yeah, they're still in Mississippi. There they are. They show up.
Maybe I'm going to have to try a few others and
I may have to
see what
try
it looks like. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. So, but yeah, I'm excited.
Thank you so much. I hope you can come back again and join us. This was wonderful. We really appreciate it, Phoebe.
Oh, you're welcome. You're welcome. Thanks for taking the time.
Yeah.
I do enjoy talking about our investigation, but it's all towards that purpose of getting the word out there in different ways. Because I am still surprised at how many. When I'm in Tulsa, how many residents, shopkeepers. I went to the mall shopping. They're doing that. We're working on it. So, I really hope they get some support for that. We have some support.
So we need to get the word out there. That's clear. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So even in
We'll
Tulsa.
do what we can here. First, absolutely.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. So appreciate it.